Hello again, and welcome to the Asia-Pacific Partnership Atrocity Prevention Working Group on Gender and Atrocity Prevention's very first webinar on intersecting vulnerabilities, converging transformative agency, women, peace, and security in the time of COVID. So before we begin, I would just like to let you know about some protocols that we have for the webinar. So for first, only the one speaking shall be unmuted. All participants, including participants, are on mute, so you will all be on listening mode. Second, participants are requested to comment and or ask questions using the chat box or the question and answer box. When posting a question, please identify to whom you are actually addressing the question to from our speakers. And this one is very important. In the event of Zoom bombing, the webinar will be immediately ended and a new webinar link will be sent to registered participants for the activity to continue. I'd just also like to say that we are live on Facebook as well as on Twitter. We will send the Twitter link if you want to have some live comments as well as in the Facebook page. For those who are actually not able to register in the Zoom webinar, they can access the live stream and ask questions in the live stream page as well. And then we would also share it in the chat box. So we are now going to begin. Let me now give the floor to our moderator for today, Dr. Sariki.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar series. As Bene mentioned, we are the gender working group of the Asia-Pacific Partnership for Atrocity Prevention, which is an alliance of organizations which aims to support the prevention of atrocity crimes and the protection of vulnerable populations within the Asia-Pacific community. The hope is to develop coherent and comprehensive plans to prevent atrocities, to mobilize the capacities of local, regional, and global actors. The Gender Working Group is chaired by the woman you just heard, Dr. Lourdes Veneracion Rolonza, who's an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Ateneo de Manila University. We thank Dr. Rolonza and her assistant, Gaia Benjamin, for their role in organizing this seminar. And just to kick us off, we have three really esteemed speakers today, the first of which is Professor Aurora de Dios, who is speaking on women, peace and security and militarized state responses, particularly in the Philippines. Many of you may know Professor de Dios, who is a leading feminist academic from the region with a lifelong advocacy for women's rights and gender equality. She's currently the Senior Project Director of the Women and Gender Institute at Miriam College in the Philippines, and she has a long academic career as the former college dean and professor at Miriam College, and she's held various government positions as well as the Philippine representative of the ASEAN Commission on the Promotion and Protection of Women's Rights, Women and Children's Rights, the chair of the National Commission on the Role of Filipino Women, and a member of the UN Committee on the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Without further ado, I'll pass this over to Professor de Dios.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Is it okay? Yes. Can you hear me? Yes. Good afternoon to everyone. In some areas, it might be good morning. First off, I'd like to congratulate the women's groups and other NGOs all over the world that are working to implement UN Security Council 1325 as we mark its adoption 20 years ago today. For many of us, working on women, peace, and security issues has been a long process of getting the resolution accepted and implemented. However, we also know that the involvement of many women leaders in peace processes in different parts of the world made a big difference in advancing peace and improving the lives of people. With the spread of COVID all over the world, women and girls are now impacted seriously, particularly in those areas that we call fragile states as well as conflict areas, and even in civilian settings. So I'd like to present today will be on state responses to this COVID-19 pandemic. And I will just limit myself to Southeast Asia, although globally we see the same pattern of militarized responses across Latin America and Africa. I will examine the terms being used in describing the pandemic, the methods utilized in accordance with the mindset and approach that I call militaristic and police-centric, and look at the impacts of these measures, particularly on women. And lastly, to look at ways we can improve the situation through recommendations that have already been forwarded by international organizations and women's groups. So I'd like to look at the first slide, please. So first, I'd like to problematize, and I think people find it very difficult to look at this pandemic as a war. But we see that the articulation of the problem in many areas by a lot of leaders is like waging war. It's like warmongering all over again. So Xi Jinping, for instance, calls this a people's war that we are up against. Boris Johnson looks at this pandemic as an enemy that is deadly and must be addressed strongly. New York Governor Cuomo, who is otherwise a very good governor, has been comparing this to World War II. Ventilators are to this war what bombs were to World War II. And of course, President Macron of France, also we are at war. Simply, we are at war. And President Donald Trump waged all-out war to defeat this virus. Not to mention, of course, Prime Minister Modi of India, that who says that every Indian complying with the country's regulations on lockdown is a soldier that is fighting this war. And even Louis Pasteur mentions that infectious diseases are like invading armies that lay siege to our bodies. Now, historically, this has been the response of men to any kind of crisis. This is what we call the masculine perspective or the macho approach to any problem. To look at the public health issue as peace and order issue. And of course, can we look at the next slide, please? So the result of that perspective is one, to get the team that will address this from the military rather than from other sectors like the public health specialists. And it also results in measures that are more authoritarian and more militaristic rather than consider other options. So for instance, in the Philippines, Duterte is definitely bringing this issue or, entrusting this issue to a group of ex-military generals as well as police, the police force. Downward, please. Rodrigo Duterte. Yes. Okay. Yeah, and of course, no, not yet. Okay, so it has resulted in lockdowns, curfews, quarantine, closure of public spaces and businesses, border controls, surveillance, emergency bayanihan law, and the anti-terror law, for example, and arrests of civilians that have been deemed as violators of the quarantine rules and measures. So in the Philippines, there have been quite a lot, 120,000 was the last count of simply, going out of your house, trying to make a living, and being arrested in the process. In Indonesia as well, they're very systematic. I got the data that the National Coronavirus Disease Response Acceleration Task Force is headed by the current disaster agency chief and former commander of the Army Special Forces, Lieutenant General Donnie Munardo. And as well, there are, so many in the cabinet right now that you can say that the whole cabinet and the whole government has been dominated by the military. So in the same manner, it has implemented border controls, travel bans, quarantines, as well as arrest of violators of these violators of the quarantine measures. Hun Sen as well, I didn't get any data from, but I'm sure because Hun Sen has been relying as well very, very much on the military, have also used the law in order to control the movement of people. For example, he has declared a state of emergency and a lockdown on the whole country, followed by the arrest of media personalities, publishers, as well as owners of newspapers who are now in detention, apparently on the charge of misinformation and anti-government articles. The same is true with Prayut. Prayut is, of course, a former general who had succeeded in replacing the civilian government. As we know, Thailand has also resorted to national lockdowns, emergency censorship of media, arrest of and detention of people supposedly spreading fake news. And earlier in the year 2019, he has resorted to abolition of political parties that are considered opposing the government. In Myanmar, I think this will be discussed more and more by Debbi. COVID-19 task force are composed of senior military officers and the same measure and control rules have been implemented in Myanmar, such as arrest and punishment of those who allegedly spread disinformation. So as we can see, these measures are sometimes overly done, and it is used, and many human rights organizations have observed that these control measures have been directed at people who are accused of opposing the government and spreading disinformation. So it is an opportunity for authoritarian governments to even to implement even more repressive measures. What is the impact of these militaristic and police-centric measures? One is that it creates panic, insecurity, anxiety, and fear on the part of civilians, because from a very peaceful environment, it suddenly turns into a like a war scenario where all your movements and all that you have to do has to pass through the scrutiny of the police. Second, that it is also quite, there is no evidence, as has been mentioned by many, that it is at all effective. We see the outcome are more arrests. We see people being fearful, but we have not seen a reduction of the main problem, which is to reduce the number of incidents of people affected by the virus. Why? Because very simply, bullets and the military cannot kill viruses. Okay, so to put this problem under the hands of the military is not only inappropriate, it's very ineffective and does not achieve the goal of reduction of the pandemic. Next, please. Next slide, please. So we see here the pictures, please. Can you see the pictures first? Yes. So these are scenes in Manila where you can see that the police and the military are all around in their full gear and sometimes with their guns, ready to arrest and to really impose their kind of order on the civilian population. So very often it can also lead to incidents like killing a civilian simply because they are out in the streets. And what happened in this particular instance was that the person who was out in the street was a person with a mental health problem. So the trigger-happy police given the license to determine whether or not a violator is carrying a gun or not. So the whole approach is based on the discretion of whoever is guarding, you know, the checkpoints. Next, please. So I'd like to look at the impact of militarization and securitization of the state responses to COVID-19. First, on the issue of looking at this problem as war, no, or waging war. Now, war metaphors are clearly bound up with the very reality of people's lives, no? The way they move, the way they live, and the spaces that they can occupy. So these are now all controlled by the use of state force and sometimes state licensed violence. And the mobilization of fear of contagion has also generated a constant and unhealthy climate of fear and surveillance everywhere. And this is a very big issue because now the burden of the spread of the virus is not looked upon as scientifically, but the burden is placed on the lack of discipline of ordinary people who are hungry and with work and resources to feed their families. No resources, and then we can see a widespread incidence of hunger everywhere. So people who violate simple rules of movement are criminalized in the process. And lastly, as I mentioned, there is no evidence at all that we can see that militarization or such measures have helped to drastically reduce the pandemic. But there are plenty of evidence of human rights violations by the police and the military. Next slide, please. So what then should we be doing? We should always, point out war is not an appropriate analogy to this current pandemic. We can call it as it has been called in the centuries when we had pandemics, a pandemic. It's a public health emergency. And the Danish queen had an analogy, and she said that this was dangerous guests that have entered our homes. And some have used the metaphor of a tunnel. We are passing through the darkest part of the tunnel, and we are going to come out of this tunnel. And to use a sports analogy or a metaphor is not bad. This is not a sprint, which means that we cannot resolve this in a few months, but it's a marathon. It can be a year, it can be 2 years, but that in this marathon, we are all implicated, and we are the very ones that can solve this problem. Next, please. Now, what about the impact of COVID emergency measures on women? I think in civilian settings, it's very clear that the lockdowns keep women from earning a living and supporting their families. As you know, in many parts of Southeast Asia, the economies where women are most dominant are in the informal sector. So informal workers do not have savings, and they live day to day or week to week. So that to disrupt their livelihood is really devastating for the women. And unless they have a steady source of income and social assistance from government, then many of them will be forced to go out. So the other consequence of this pandemic is that lockdowns increase their care work burden in taking care of the sustenance of the family, caring for the sick and the elderly, and attending now, because of the lockdown, to children's educational needs, apart from when they are working in the office, working at home. So in some cases, and this is already documented. In many countries, there is very evident increase in incidents of domestic violence. And the problem with this is that you are locked down with your oppressor. So there is you are prevented from either escaping and reporting and accessing services for domestic violence cases. Quarantine areas are also subject to police control and scrutiny. And in the process, these checkpoints, police have, the kind of authority that can intimidate people, particularly women and very poor women. There are reports in the Philippines that there are a lot of sexual harassment being done to women who would like to go out for a while to earn a living. So these are also the threats that they see on an everyday basis. Vulnerabilities for many women, particularly heightened among women with disabilities, elderly women, and LGBTQ women who are often very much stigmatized and discriminated against in the community. Next, please. What about in displaced and refugee women situations? I think we missed. Yes, this one. So in terms of the situation of displaced and refugee women and girls, disruptions to critical health, humanitarian and development programs, including provisions for material health, sexual and reproductive care, and gender-based violence-related services are very much inimical to the needs of the women who are then deprived of these services. And despite the global call for ceasefire made by the UN Secretary General, we see that there are still ongoing conflicts in those areas that may have had a ceasefire, but have continuing local conflicts. So the result of this is that a lot of this, in the Philippines, we call them bakwits. And of course, we also refer to women who are in settlements, in camps, like refugee camps like the Rohingya and the immigration detention centers in Bangkok, who are, are very vulnerable to these ongoing conflicts and are unable to flee to safety. So restrictions on the movements of police and security forces can create a rule of law vacuum in remote communities and increase the prevalence of sexual and gender-based violence and target women human rights defenders. So what should we be doing? In humanitarian cases, military and police actions must be guided by the so-called Oslo guidelines on humanitarian assistance. The first is that there should be a recognition of the human suffering with particular attention to the most vulnerable in the population, such as women, children, and the elderly. They must observe neutrality. That means to say that humanitarian assistance must be provided without engaging in hostilities or taking sides in controversies of a political, religious, or ideological nature. And impartiality, that humanitarian assistance must be provided without discrimination as to ethnic origin, gender, nationality, race, or religion. Next, please. So what about in the civilian settings? I think military and police would have to be there, admittedly, to help stabilize the situation. But instead of stabilizing, as I mentioned, they're creating anxiety. So if there must be the presence of police and military, they should be guided by the following principles. One is that these emergency measures, lockdowns, curfews, travel bans, must be provided by law and must not be arbitrary and unreasonable. Second, it must be necessary. There must be an urgent or a necessary reason for doing so. And the reason for imposing such measures is for the protection of public health and a response to a pressing social need. Proportionality principle. This is to must be appropriate to achieve protective function and must not be too intrusive. So for instance, there are many communities that are quite free or have very low levels of COVID-19 cases. But in many cases, a lockdown is almost like total without regard to the specificity of each area that will be affected by the lockdown. Non-discrimination. This means that the assistance should not discriminate based on class, ethnicity, or gender, or even political parties. In some areas and in many cases, it's also used to benefit only the allies of the particular political leader and deprive those that are deemed as opposing parties. And of course, lastly, gender sensitivity, awareness of the differential needs of women and men in providing for humanitarian assistance. In a state of emergency, from the perspective of human rights, derogations of rights may be allowed during emergencies, but it should be proportionate and limited to those strict requirements by exigency of the situation, and should cover issues like how many weeks, months, the duration of these measures, the geographical coverage, and the substantive basis of such emergency measures. First is, of course, that it be strictly temporary in nature and not institutionalized as a permanent measure to control the population. Second, it should not be too intrusive. We have cases of police entering private homes and residences in pursuit of a violator, which is not allowed by law. And thirdly, it should be transparent. That means that these measures must be monitored, must be reviewed, and subject to changes when necessary. Lastly, can I have the last the recommendations? I think I will simplify the recommendations. There are hundreds of recommendations that have come out, especially from feminist groups. But one is that we should avoid purely militaristic approach in dealing with the pandemic. Instead, we should diversify the composition of the COVID task forces and to include public health, social work, and psychology experts and community organizers in order to have a more balanced and a diversified and rational response to the pandemic. Second, direct consultations with severely affected communities and to include them in the decision making in order to get their cooperation and assistance in implementing very restrictive measures. Otherwise, the authorities are inviting very strong resistance from the public, which is now happening everywhere. And the third and last is for women leaders to be included in these task forces. As you have noticed, almost all of the task forces on COVID in many areas, many countries, in almost all of the countries of ASEAN, only include men and men from the military at that. So this is not a balanced composition. And women leaders can contribute in terms of their perspectives, in their experience, and the best practices that we have seen led by women leaders in New Zealand, in Germany, in the Scandinavian countries, and many more. So I think it would be wise for governments to include these diversified sectors in order that we can have a realistic as well as a rational approach that can reduce this pandemic the shortest time possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor De Dios. Our next presenter is Debbi Stothard, who has a long career as a human rights defender and human rights activist. She's worked with diverse communities to engage states, international organizations, and other stakeholders throughout Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas on human rights and justice. She has facilitated or been a resource person for nearly 300 training events in the past 15 years, much of that focused on Burma, Myanmar. Today, she's talking about women, peace, and security in the context of armed conflict in Myanmar, and I'll hand it over to you, Debbi.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to Professor Dios for that contribution. I'm sharing my screen now with a PowerPoint. Okay, so we're looking at the intersection of vulnerabilities of women from Burma, Myanmar, over the past 6 months, from the 1st of January to the 30th of June, mindful of the fact that the population in Kachin State, if you're looking at the map now, Kachin State and Shan State border China, and Kachin State, which has entered a 9th year of conflict, had people, local people protesting on the border, calling for the national authorities to close the border as early as January and February, when they were very well aware of the threat of COVID-19. However, the border was only closed on April the 24th by China and not by the Myanmar authorities. What we need to be aware is that during this 6-month period, military attacks have continued, and many either have targeted civilian populations or failed to protect civilian populations. We're looking at 608 armed clashes or attacks on civilians, which took place in 10 out of the 14 states and regions: Kachin State, Shan State, Kaya or Karenni State, Karen State, Sagaing Division, Chin, Rakhine, and Mon State, and also in the Go region, which is considered central. So this should already tell us that the existence, the ongoing armed conflicts happening pretty much throughout the country have actually intensified the threat of COVID-19. If you look at the official figures, the official death toll, and I say official because the authorities have very much neglected the border areas where conflict has been ongoing, particularly Kachin and Shan State. We have 6 official deaths, but we also have, compared to 169 civilian deaths attributed to armed conflict in the past 6 months, and we're talking about on average 100 incidents a month in the country. And last week up in Kachin State, there was a tragic landslide at the Jade Mine, which resulted in over 170 deaths. And we have to be mindful that because it's the rainy season, these landslides happen quite frequently. The Myanmar authorities claim to have addressed the issues by instituting bans and other restrictions, but they have not actually ensured implementation. So when Professor Dios talks about the militarized approach to COVID-19, it goes without saying that the military have a very important and prominent role in addressing COVID-19, and in doing so, they've taken a highly militarized approach and have actually placed military actions and clearance operations higher, prioritize that above public health. And the reality check of this is that the military budget of Myanmar Burma is now 280% more than the military budget in 2011. So in the past 9 years, we've seen an increase of the military budget by 280%. And health and education combined is less than half of the military budget, despite the decades of the decades of deprivation of the public health and public education system. So we are really facing a very, very difficult situation. Against this backdrop, there are 4 judicial processes going on in the context of Burma, Myanmar's genocide and atrocity crimes targeting the Rohingya and other ethnic minorities. The state of Gambia sued Burma over for potentially violating the Genocide Convention at the International Court of Justice. And in January, the ICJ imposed provisional measures. A lot of this information is available on the ALTSEAN website in a briefer that was produced in May. But what we can see from these provisional measures to prevent acts constituting genocide and prevent other groups from committing or planning acts of genocide, including hate speech and incitement, is that there has been no fundamental legislative or institutional reform to halt that. So we're not just seeing an ongoing threat against communities, particularly women from Rohingya community, but also the Buddhist Rakhine community in Rakhine State, the Kachin, the Mon, the Karenni, the Shan, the Ta'ang, and pretty much all the communities that were marked in the area of red, where conflict has happened, where military attack or civilian deaths as resulting from military attack have taken place in the past 6 months. Now, the response to the provisional measures has been mainly, the response to the provisional measures have been mainly in the form of presidential directives. There was a presidential directive to comply with the Genocide Convention, a presidential directive to preserve evidence in Rakhine State, incidentally after the military basically destroyed a lot of evidence in that area in 2018 and 2019, and a presidential directive on anti-hate speech activities. There does not seem to be much in the way of actions to implement these directives, and what we have seen is instead 169 civilian deaths, 499 injuries, 507 detentions, and 800 cases of torture, and tens of thousands displaced in those conflict areas. The military dominated government still continues to have an internet blackout across Rakhine and Chin states, which affect approximately 1 million people. And this has actually been going on for more than a year already, since June 2019. And they have blocked over 221 websites for allegedly spreading fake news about COVID-19. It's important to note that most of the blocked websites actually include ethnic news media outlets, which are relied upon by many ethnic communities who may not be able to read Burmese and would have a chance to gain access to targeted and relevant information, including about COVID. And 2 of these blocked websites are in Rakhine State. So it's important to note that while clearance operations targeting the Rohingya people took place during 2016 and 2017, we've had military attacks and clearance operations ongoing in Rakhine State, this time targeting the Arakan army since January of last year. So if you can always go to our website to get updated data on where these clashes, the clashes that I'm talking about, but you can already see that Rakhine State, Shan State, Karen State, and Chin State have been some of the places where the highest number of violent incidents by military have taken place. And it's important to note that in Karen State, where 55 incidents have happened, including the military attacking and dismantling health checkpoints set up by the local people in response to COVID-19. In Kayin or Karen State, there's actually a peace agreement in force. So it's quite shocking to note that. What are the responses? We've seen, despite the high level of threat, a number of coalitions coming up from different organizations. Justice from Myanmar calls itself a covert alliance because they don't announce their membership, but they do actually put out information to target military leaders in this situation. And one of this is the fact that they are calling for more scrutiny and targeted sanctions against individuals and companies that directly benefit or are partially owned by military or military personnel. And this is quite important in the context of COVID, because a lot of public funds and assets are being used up by these military influence and dominated companies, when they should be actually going into something like public health and education and peace. Despite the threat of COVID and despite the increased restrictions, we also see ongoing calls by community groups for transitional justice and accountability. In this case, this example was put up in June 16 last month to mark the 21 years. Is it 21 years? The 25th year of the anniversary of a massacre in Shan State, which it also was part of a clearance operation that led to 400,000 people being forcibly displaced. The online solidarity is still strong despite trolling and online threats, particularly targeting women. One in mid-June, Black for Rohingya, which is an annual online solidarity effort, where participants are called to wear something black and post a photo on social media in solidarity. We saw that the solidarity expressed by ethnic women from Burma with Rohingya ended up becoming something that was very meaningful to the online community. For example, we had one of our interns, our trainees from Kachin State and from Shan and Kaya State, took part in this campaign, despite knowing that they could probably be trolled and criticized and even vilified for doing so. And we saw that our original post on Facebook was shared 243 times. And one of the sharers actually wrote a poem and reposted these photos, and his posting was shared another 223 times. And so it's quite important to note that groups are still speaking out. Women's League of Burma, to mark the International Day in Support of Victims of Torture, also spoke out of the ongoing use of rape and sexual violence as a form of torture by the military targeting ethnic women, including local women human rights defenders, and documenters. So you can see here that their press conference was viewed on Facebook Live for more than 14,000 times and shared numerous times. So we can see that the women are, despite the intimidation and the threat, are still speaking out, still doing the documentation, and still expressing their solidarity in whichever way they can. So that's the end of the presentation. I'm just looking forward to an opportunity to respond to questions. There's lots more things to talk about. And back to you, Sarah.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Debbi. Just to remind everyone, if you have a question, please just put it in the Q&A box. We'll be collating the questions at the end of the session for the speakers, and the best way to do that so people aren't talking over one another is just to write that in the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And I understand there's also a question capacity on the Facebook Live posting as well. Our next speaker is Dwi Rubianti Kholifa, or Ruby Kholifa, who is Secretary General of the Asian Muslim Action Network. She's been leading the AMAN, the Asian Muslim Action Network chapter in Indonesia since 2007 to strengthen community resilience through the role of women, managing 38 women's schools for peace in 7 provinces of Indonesia, and has been involved in more than 1,500 interfaith mothers as leaders of change initiatives. She's also very active in the implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 1325 in Indonesia, including, I understand, very busy lately in a review of the first National Action Plan on 1325. Without further ado, handing it over to Ruby.
Thank you, Sarah. So I'm going to share my screen. So hello, everyone. So this time I am, after listening to stories that totally different situation with Indonesia, but I can resonate some of the common phenomena, like the engagement of more military actors and institutions in the COVID-19 response. Has been I mean, a lot of discussion on that by civil society. And today I am interested to focus in 2 issues. Number one is I'm not going to detail in projecting what happened in Indonesia, particularly the impact of COVID-19, because comparing with other countries are almost similar. But I will give more time for how women peace builders use the crisis to strengthen social cohesion. So just very brief about the impact in Indonesia context. Of course, like you may also understand that economic is one of the worst, I mean, because there are a lot of women actually engaged in the informal sectors. And when the closure of a lot of business and also a company, fabric, for example, so that's women actually more impacted. And not only that, I think because many women, they have a limited access to education and also has a lower payment. So that is actually make the situation worse. On the issue of health, I think I will focus in reducing the sexual reproductive health services in some of the hospitals. And health clinics at the community level, because everything is like focusing on a COVID-19. All the priority is COVID-19 patient. So this is part of our advocacy. Later on, I will explain. Unpaid work, I think it's been discussed a lot by Professor Aurora, that also in Indonesia context, you will see that a lot of stress and also impact to violence against women. Recently, even the number of the sexual violence against children are also intensifying. Other serious issue that we are dealing right now is the domestic violence. I think 2 data can confirm one is coming from the Ministry of Women Empowerment itself, that actually opened hotlines and responding the people reporting domestic violence cases. So the number is quite high. From 3rd of June, from 29 February to 3rd of June, you will see like almost 500 cases. I think now it's more than that. And also the number is really like a parallel with the cases that against the children. So, and recently in the last 2 weeks, I think children cases are more and more. And survey done by Komnas Perempuan, the National Commission on Anti-Violence Against Women, also showing a similar pattern. And even the specific respondent earning under $600 per month, they are more vulnerable. And unfortunately, less cases actually reported even to the hotline belonging to government or to civil society. So other concern that we are dealing is also fake news spreading. I think the social media is creating more panic and more, how do you call it, fear among the people, knowing that almost 86, if I'm not mistaken, the people of Indonesia rely on information through social media. And the rise of racial discrimination and xenophobia. Perhaps in the context of Indonesia, we don't have much data reported, but if you look at social media, anti-China rhetoric increase, and that actually, people, we have a bad history. Our relation with the China is already long history, but now it's like a rising again, and blaming Chinese people spreading a virus. But in the real, I haven't got a report on that attacking to the Chinese people, for example. But one of the interesting report about ethnic Chinese shop owner refusing to increase the price of product she sells, and instead encouraging customer not to engage in panic buying may help, a little to counter prejudice against the ethnic group. There are a lot of good, response to try to make people, believe that the anti-China rhetoric should not, turn to the real action. So, however, I think we also a serious issue on rise extremist activity in social media have been portrayed by one of the researchers from the University of Indonesia, measuring that in terms of motivation, ideology, and capability, number of the accounts that affiliated and been monitored by many researchers showing the increasing activities in using the narrative of COVID-19 to against the government. For example, in the context of motivation, there are two issues that have been very much powerful used by the extremist group. Pray from Home. It's got a lot of reaction from the people, and then they twisted the narrative of safety into subjecting to discrimination against Muslim, obviously consider an effort to close down all the mosques in Indonesia. So that also, create a lot of tension among the group who are still in the position that they are believe in the very conservative idea. Economic instability is another issue. And in terms of the ideology, there are a lot of propaganda on better die for jihad instead of die for COVID-19. That actually calling for the members to respond for jihad in this time. And capability, this is very much linked with the stay-at-home policy, because many people exposure in social media, in virtual world, and then they're also providing a lot of content that actually easy to be catch up by the young people, or a lot of website that's having very attractive content, easily also to be searched by the young people. So, however, I think I agree with Dr. Mia Bloom in capturing the situation in the global and the national, that 3 ways how the extremists using COVID-19, undermining people trust. It is very true, and use the inaptitude of the government leaders, also very obvious. You will see a lot of them actually promoting inequalities, corruption, failure. In some of the places, it is true, but not generalize the situation. But then the narrative is on and on, trying to convince the people to believe. And destruction of the crisis expand their basis is very, we don't see yet in the context of the extremists, but for the group that actually associated with the radical thinking, they are actually gaining space as well in distributing the food package, or even some other humanitarian program freely, that actually competing with the progressive as well as with the government program. So that's quite dangerous. And this is just a list of the government response. Of course, interagency task force led by military personnel, yes. But we've been advocating a lot since the task force release around February, that we want to make sure that all the groups actually engage, including the connection with the civil society and also the volunteers group, so they can always be monitored what happened inside the interagency task force belong to the government. The social media become one of the channel that actually share a lot of information and update information in every second in this context. And we don't the government prefer to use large-scale social restriction instead of lockdown, meaning that substantial services are still operating. People still can mobile, civil society can still work, including the civil society that actually providing services for victim and survivor of domestic violence. They are still can work on that. However, some limitation if we are using transportation, public transportation. So this is the sum of the policy to respond GBV. Formally, the Ministry of Women Empowerment released 8 protocols dealing with the GBV. And also there are many other programs dealing with the psychosocial. And okay, one I think quite progress is actually approving the new category of women victims of human rights violation to receive special social protection supported by government. It is also because civil society endorsed the government to open more criteria, not just ordinary one, like poor, disability, and this thing, but we want more than that, because there are many specific criteria at the grassroots level. So how we do actually respond, we actually believe that rising culture of empathy is very huge. You can see that a lot of movement from local until national level trying to respond COVID-19, from providing common kitchen, for example, in Yogyakarta, run by feminist group, is amazing, to reaching 1,000 people using it, as well as actually there is a lot of fun and supporting the most marginalized people, specifically women working in informal sector. Charity concert by national artists also raised a lot of fund. The movement of Rice Box is also run by many women volunteers, not NGO, but is really volunteer gathering, and then they are also responding on that. So with that, actually, we have a lot of response coming from the group like AMAN. I'm just trying to compile it in the framework of women, peace and security, that a lot of work has been done, including to challenge the current structure, the formal structure of interagency task force, which in the beginning lack of women representation. So we actually did a lot of advocacy on that. And the way we do, we will share after this. The other is we make sure inclusion happening in the community level, where AMAN working currently 39 communities, We've been working there for almost 13 years. And when crisis happened, we want our women leaders at the grassroots level really handling it well and ensuring that the government recognize their leadership and also their meaningful participation. It is not just engaged, just formally, but really engaged in verifying the data, opening possibility for new criteria, distribution, and some others, and together with men in the community. Others is actually our focus more on marginalized group. Why? Because a lot of work actually been provided for family in general. So AMAN rather focus on Shia group, for example, transgender, sex workers, women working in beauty salon, massage place, and some others, engagement where the women impacted economically because of COVID. Not only that, I think one of the big lesson for us is actually create a space for enhanced empathy among interfaith youths by having direct visit to marginalized group, because our wings, young people, also we push them to also reaching out the most marginalized in the community. Here, that the scenario that we've been doing advocacy at the national level together with the other civil society. When we understand that interagency task force was lack of women representation, so our first move at that time is actually calling up civil society, specifically women, to gather, and then we formed task force on gender mainstreaming on COVID-19. But we're realizing that a lot of local government joining with the forum, then we know that this is important for them, how actually to translate gender mainstreaming policy into the COVID-19 response. So we allowing the task force. So the target of the task force is actually one, to interagency task force on COVID-19 led by Doni, Mr. Doni, and a lot of military there, yes. The other is Ministry of Women Empowerment and the major group, the CSO major group. So CSO major group is actually hundreds of CSO gathering there, but of course it's always struggle to ensure that gender mainstreaming applied. So therefore, the task force itself has become a big group, and then we do a different strategy to reach the different target. So just skip this one. Now the task force preparing for monitoring of the effectiveness of gender mainstreaming in Indonesia during COVID-19. We are going to launch this maybe early August to see how effective we are in doing gender mainstreaming. We're doing also increasing the credible voices from women ulama, because we know that many people will finding a way how actually to learn more religion. There is a survey in Indonesia that people of Indonesia is getting more conscious about to be religiously. So therefore, we actually providing a lot of webinar and discussion in social media and online together with the group called KUPI, the Congress Ulama Perempuan Indonesia, is Indonesia Women Ulama Congress, that gathering hundreds of women ulama joining. This is the new webinar that maybe some of you joining already in Southeast Asia. We just initiated Southeast Asia Women Peacebuilders. Regularly we have a webinar at the national level. We also focusing on extremism. It seems like extremism issues become bigger in the context of Indonesia. Lesson, I think finding credible voices in the context of Indonesia very important. The credible voices in the context is currently is government and the progressive women ulama. So therefore, we actually invested into two groups to help the government because why the government? Because there are still open space for civil society to engage, and we are still having a lot of space how actually to intervene in the policy as well as in the intervention. However, I think what we learned from the task force is actually collective ownership of the task force, very important, and to make sure that everyone being recognized, as well as actually to move as the collective action, and also recognize individual inside the task force. And engaging local government is very important. I think our work has become more easier because a lot of 21 government institution from 21 provinces engage regularly with the task force to help them in how to sensitize the program with the gender sensitive indicator, and also time to time, and we open for consultation. Other thing is, I think this is very important, I would like to highlight, the community support that's supporting women empowerment so far are likely to promote inclusion in the process. And you will see the role of women are recognized very well. And then also the recovery also faster comparing to the community, which actually absent of any program of women empowerment. I mean, like male domination is still very high in some of the area. And then we investigated and we know that is very lack of gender, very lack of the women empowerment program. We using the working together slogan and value, Gotong Royong, to actually building the spirit to engage our community and help one another. I think almost maybe currently, I think level of solidarity is very high. Even if you see in some of the places that the government very weak in terms of responding, because we have 34 provinces. But if you see civil society are very strong and they believe that working together will resolve the situation, then actually there are a lot of improvement on the ground. So this is my last challenge, database. I think we struggle about this. A lot of complaint, a lot of how do you call it? A lot of a chaotic situation happening on the ground because of the data. The data actually can be updated. However, the response from local government are different. So therefore, in some of the places are too difficult to change the data, but in some other places, too easy even to promote the new criteria of beneficiaries. So it's really a challenge. And spreading religious misconception to not believe the government. Therefore, I'm sorry if some of you are still have very lack of trust to the government. This situation, we have to trust to the government because of the civic space there, and then we still can do something. And civil disobedience still we can find in some other places, specifically for those who believe on the very, very conservative ideology. So they tend to refuse all the information that actually putting on the official sources, government or even civil society. Consistently flooding social media, a challenge for us because sometimes our energy is so, dry, and then looking at the extremist group, they are keeping their energy. So our challenge is how we maintain the level of how do you call it, frequency in social media, to ensure that when people open the social media and want to learn about Islam, they will automatically meet the progressive voices, not opposite. And very sad, currently, the time when sexual violence is increasing, our parliament has just dropped the bill on the sexual violence eradication just now, and then that make a lot of how do you call it, a lot of energy again to bring it up into the priority. But there are still a lot of lobby done by the group. And lastly, the more engagement of military, we worry about that, as you also worry about it. But what we want to ensure is the diverse actors are still there and prioritize using non-military measurement to respond COVID-19, we hope is still there, and civil society trying to maintain it in order to make sure that we are really preserving our democracy. So I think that's it, what I can share. Perhaps we can continue with the discussion. Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Ruby. Look, those are three fascinating and interlinked presentations speaking about the problem of militarization in the context of COVID-19, looking at it in terms in its relationship to preventing violent extremism, and in the context of genocidal violence in Myanmar. We have one question to begin, and I encourage others who have additional questions to go ahead and put them in the chat function or the Q&A. But the first question is targeted to Professor De Dios. It is, and just if you can unmute yourselves to answer the questions, that would be great. The question for Professor De Dios is, how can we push the recommendations that you put forward to governments that are purposefully excluding health experts and women?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for that question. I think it's quite difficult for Southeast Asian governments because, as we saw in the last few years, there have been an increase in authoritarian governments, including the Philippines. The Philippine government has been quite extreme in its exclusion of women, not only accusing them of being part of the opposition movement against the government, but arresting, in many cases, arresting some of those whom they have been charged with actually fake charges. So, and then several journalists have also been silenced because a lot of legal cases have been charged against them. So these are silencing techniques that have been done by governments. In other contexts, when I was in ASEAN, I noticed that the Ministry of Women, for instance, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, as well as in Cambodia, had very high levels of ranking in the government, meaning to say that there are ministry levels. And in other countries in ASEAN, they were degraded. I mean, the ministry, they're not ministerial level, but they are under other agencies. So what does that mean? Well, it means that they do not sit in decision-making, what they call the circles, like in the cabinet. And so because of that, they are excluded from major policy making, including the formation of task forces in addressing COVID. It's a major problem because I think women have tried their very best to join government and to cooperate with government, but with very limited success. Now, what I have seen in the last few months is that many of the women leaders, if they are unable to join these major policy-making groups in the government, work at the local level with communities as well as with NGOs and groups that are academe or media-based, and they're able to reach out to communities and populations where government services are lacking. And that is where women really shine. I would have suggested to many women leaders to really push for reforms in government, including, you know, the soliciting the help of public health experts by writing to these governments, as well as, you know, opening up spaces for dialogue. I don't know to what extent we can be successful in that, but there's no harm in trying. And many groups have done so. And why am I proposing that? Well, because it it looks like women's leadership in handling these crises elsewhere have some lessons to be learned, you know, and some assistance and some perspective coming from different groups might in fact benefit the task forces that have so far have been unable to reduce the incidence of COVID cases, simply because they're using you know, a monolithic approach, which is control and peace and order approach. So I would hope that with the coalition of women's voices and NGOs, that this dialogue can occur with government officers that are much more open to such dialogues. There are, we know, for instance, that in Congress as well as in the Senate, there are those government officials that would be open to such dialogue. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Professor De Dios. Our second question is to Debbi. And the question relates to the current state of COVID-19 in Myanmar. A participant noted that 6 deaths is quite small. And does this mean that Myanmar is better off in dealing with this pandemic than other countries in the region?
Thanks, Josephine, for asking that question. I think there's a big trust deficit in Burma, Myanmar. The authorities only seem to have counted deaths that were linked to patients who flew in from Western countries or who were infected in Yangon, the main city. So traditionally the public health situation is really, really bad, very horrible. One of the lowest ratio, one of the highest ratio of sorry, how do you say it? The health professionals, especially in rural areas and ethnic minority areas, are much, much lower than compared to the main cities of Yangon or Mandalay, and the best health facilities are actually in the capital, Naypyidaw. So you can already start to see that surveillance was very bad. I was in Myanmar during February and early March. And if you were in Yangon, for example, your temperature was scanned and you were offered hand sanitizer before you entered any of the international hotels or the big pub shopping centers. But when I checked into the hotels, I was staying in various parts of the country during that period, in the far south, in the north, northeast, and northwest. They were automatically scanning our temperature, but they had no idea what to do if we had a high temperature. And secondly, we had hotel staff coughing and sneezing on us. So basically, it wasn't, and all the public health signs were up in all the international locations, and it was part of the effort by the national government to show a particular face to foreigners. So we can already start to see that there has been very poor surveillance. In January, February, the Kachins who border with China were already protesting and calling for border closure because they were panicking. They were saying the health situation, health facilities are so poor. If it comes into our state, we won't be able to deal with it. But in the end, the border was only closed on April 24th by China. So we have 100,000 internally displaced people because of conflict in Kachin state who have been internally displaced for 9 years, and still, and many of them went to China. Some of them, heads of families, went to China to seek work so that they could support their IDP families in Kachin state, and they came back from China with very little surveillance and health check in the early stages of the pandemic. And then China closed the border to prevent these people from coming back into China and potentially bringing the virus back. So the border remains closed till June the 24th, and it was only on April the 27th that the national government started some type of coordination with the Kachin state government and local authorities. So we don't know what's happening on the ground. People were already getting sick because of the cold weather. Sometimes it snows during winter in Kachin state. There were many people were living, the IDPs were living in very poor accommodation. There are many people who are coming back, who have come back across the border, who are living without electricity, and with all these ethnic websites shut down by the government. One of my students was telling me that her family were totally shocked when they heard about COVID last month, because they had been living in a remote area without electricity, without much access to communication. So they had no idea. So there's a huge gap. If you are living in an urban area, you might know about it. If you are living in if you're a Burman, you're more likely to know about it than if you are an ethnic person. And it's actually the local volunteers that have been working very hard. If you look at the coverage on COVID in Myanmar, the narrative is that the virus is coming from people who came from Western countries, and also they're blaming Rohingya and Muslims who they're claiming that they are the ones, if they come back from Bangladesh, they are bringing the virus. There's no talk whatsoever about the fact that the virus, the pandemic started in China, and that there has been no effort to stop border trade. In fact, what they're trying to do is keep the goods crossing the border from Burma to China and China to Burma, but changing over the drivers once they reach the border. So we're quite, it's quite shocking. I think in ASEAN generally, there is a huge trust deficit. ASEAN is a hopeless mess. We have not seen a comprehensive coordination on COVID. Just as we have not seen comprehensive coordination on how to deal with the impacts of the climate crisis in our region. So we are seeing some intersecting vulnerabilities here, because communities already vulnerable to climate change and the global financial crisis are also being impacted by COVID-19. Most of last week we had an ASEAN summit, and most of the talk was basically about restarting the economy, as though people don't, as if human beings are not the main agents of the economy. So we already start to see that the thinking is not there. Even Vietnam is saying they have 300 cases, and maybe, I think for a long time they were saying no deaths whatsoever. But the USS Theodore Roosevelt, which had 1,000 cases of COVID and several deaths, actually were infected from shore leave in Da Nang in southern Vietnam. So in Yangon, most of the human rights activists already started, and NGOs started working from home in March, even before there was any official acknowledgement of the government, because they totally didn't trust their government. So they started taking precautions ahead of the government. So I think there's a lot more to be learned about what's going on the ground. And I think the restrictions on data and information coming out, especially of the conflict areas, is a problem.
Thanks so much, Debbi. We have just one more question, and this is directed to Ruby, and it's about the sexual violence bill that has recently been delayed or quashed. And the question relates to this has been in the works for quite a long time, this bill. What are some of the reasons that it's been delayed at this important time, and what action can be taken to reprioritize it?
So we actually don't have from the parliament perspective, they said that a lot of other concern relating with the crisis. So actually kind of replace the bill with the new bill that actually tackling on COVID-19 our law relating with the disaster management does not comprehend about the pandemic like COVID-19. Therefore, people, it is created a lot of panic, and then there is so much energy in how actually doing coordination and including the dealing with the people themselves. But one of the, if we relate the history of the advocacy on the sexual violence eradication bill, it was only one party, political party, which actually totally against about this bill. This coming from very conservative political party, the Prosperous Justice Party. It was the only one. The reason is because they thought that this create a lot of space for liberation in Indonesia. And then if we confirm directly with the text actually inside all the article, there is nothing to do with that. Specifically what they fear is actually opening more opportunity for LGBT to actually enjoying their sexual rights in Indonesia. So that is the big reason coming from that party. But how this bill become, all the party agree to actually delete from the priority, that actually really much with the transaction inside the parliament, I guess, because the bill is already in the parliament since 2012. We started the bill, and there are a lot of support from different actors. But now the discourse, the national discourse now is rising again in ensuring the parliament really pay attention on this. And the parliament said, we will do next year. So next year will be, and again, the civil society been giving the promise for the next year. But on that, actually, we also facing a lot of sexual violence incident, in different places on behalf of, for example, the culture, or even a lot of sexual violence against the children. But I think that can be, also the reason why now even the Ministry of Women Empowerment herself now have to go in front to advocate the bill together with all deputies because of more cases rising. And a lot of debate in the TV channel about this issue, as well as a lot of lobby among our friends who are in the parliament. However, we lost some women who are in charge in the leadership in the parliament. So we are very now pessimistic that the bill will be put it up again as a priority this year, because when the parliament already settling all the agenda, because it's already we cannot change anymore. So next year will be the opportunity. It's very strange when I see that, like in Indonesia, the agenda of women empowerment is high, and we have a space to do that. But in the formation of the interagency COVID task force, for example, at the beginning, even Ministry of Women Empowerment did not include it. They would just exclude. It's very strange as well, because we actually have in particularly regulation on gender mainstreaming in disaster management. So very clear, but that kind of regulation, and in the beginning, did not, the regulation just ignore. And then when civil society reacted, and then we put a lot of media to blow up about this issue, 29th of April, then the interagency task force revised the letter, and then they included the Ministry of Women Empowerment. So for us, it's still, how come this? I mean, we have so long history on the engagement of women in the peacebuilding or development or any issue, and then it's simply just ignored and neglected when responding into the big crisis like this happening. But again, I think we have to thank the civil society that's always working on that. So yeah, that's the situation, even in Indonesia.
Well, thank you, Ruby. And thanks to all the panelists, Debbi, Ruby, and Professor Dios, for your presentations. There was a question on Facebook regarding the ability to share the PowerPoints. This this is recorded and it will be posted on Facebook. So the whole presentation will be available as a recording, and you can access the presentation through that recording, as I understand. I didn't ever introduce myself. I'm Dr. Sarah Teed. I am the Deputy Director of the Asia Pacific Center for the Responsibility to Protect. We support the Asia Pacific Partnership for Atrocity Prevention. So we're going to close it off, and I'm just going to hand it over to Dr. Rolonza real quickly.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And thank you so much to Professor Dios, Debbi, Ruby, and we're actually all members of the working group for gender and atrocity prevention of the APPAP group. And as I mentioned a while ago, this is the first time that APPAP actually is hosting a webinar, as well as the first time for the working group on gender and atrocity prevention to host as well a webinar. We have to be very quick in terms of adapting to these situations. Our second part is going to be on next week, July 14. Another group of the working group will present the other issues insofar as women, peace, and security is concerned. And we look forward that you would be able to join us once again. So yes, on behalf of the APPAP working group on gender and atrocity prevention, thank you so much for everyone, and I wish you all a good day. Bye-bye.